It began like any other December morning in New York City. The subway was alive with its usual rhythm, trains screeching to a halt, the faint murmur of conversations, the footsteps of commuters rushing to catch their rides. Among them, a woman sat quietly, tucked away in a corner of the train, her eyes closed, resting. She wasn't aware of the man watching her. She wasn't aware that in just moments, her world would be consumed by fire. What happened next is almost too horrifying to believe. A sudden flick of a lighter, a burst of flames, and screams filled the air. The man responsible, he didn't flee, he didn't show remorse. Instead, he laughed, standing there, watching as his victim burned. Who was she? Why has no one come forward to claim her as their own? Who was the man, standing calmly in the chaos, as though what he had just done was no more significant than lighting a cigarette? And most chilling of all, what could drive someone to commit such an act of unimaginable cruelty? This is not just a story about a crime. It's a story about unanswered questions, a justice system racing to piece together the truth and the unnerving reality that someone like this could walk unnoticed among us. The victim's identity remains a mystery. Her name, her story, her life, lost in the flames of that horrifying moment. As for the man, his actions raise more questions than answers. He claims he doesn't remember. He says he was intoxicated. But is that the truth? Or is there a far darker explanation for what happened on that subway platform? This story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about safety, humanity, and the dangers lurking in the spaces we take for granted. It forces us to ask, how could this happen? Why did it happen? And most unsettling of all, could it happen again? Today, we examine the case that shocked an entire city. A case so gruesome, so senseless, it's hard to comprehend. Stay with me as we uncover every chilling detail, every unanswered question, and every haunting possibility surrounding this crime. To fully understand the horror of what happened that day, we need to take a step back and paint a picture of where it all began. The Coney Island Stillwell Avenue subway station, one of the busiest transit hubs in New York City, is a sprawling structure. Serving multiple train lines, it's a lifeline for thousands of commuters every single day. But it's also a place where time seems to blur, a constant shuffle of people coming and going, faces passing like shadows, and lives intersecting for brief, fleeting moments. It was early morning, just past dawn, when the city was beginning to stir. The winter chill hung heavy in the air, and the station's usual vibrancy felt subdued under the dim glow of fluorescent lights. The platforms, usually teeming with activity during rush hour, were quieter than usual, a handful of commuters wrapped in thick coats, sipping coffee, or scrolling through their phones. And then there was the other side of this station's story. Like so many parts of the subway system, Coney Island Stillwell Avenue was no stranger to challenges. Over the years, it had become a microcosm of the city's struggles with homelessness, mental health, and safety. Late at night, and in the early hours of the morning, the platforms often became temporary shelters for those with nowhere else to go. Some commuters had grown used to stepping over sleeping bodies or ignoring the quiet pleas for spare change. Amidst this backdrop sat a lone figure, a woman, curled up in the corner of an empty subway car. She was sleeping, her head tilted against the window, her body still as the train rattled into the station. Who was she? That question remains unanswered even today. Witnesses described her as appearing disheveled, her clothes worn and layered against the cold. Some thought she might have been homeless, seeking refuge from the biting December wind. Others suggested she was simply exhausted, like so many New Yorkers who've fallen asleep on a late-night train ride. What's certain is this: at that moment, she was completely vulnerable, alone, unaware, and defenseless. But how did she get there? Was she just another weary traveler caught in the city's endless motion, or did her presence on that train hold clues to a larger story? Perhaps she had been on her way to somewhere, or someone, or perhaps she had nowhere to go at all. While the other passengers went about their routines, she remained motionless, her stillness blending into the background of a city that often overlooks those on its margins. No one stopped to check on her, no one asked if she was okay. And then, on the same platform, there was him. A man who would later be identified as Sebastian Zapata Khalil. He moved with a purpose that was difficult to define, neither hurried nor entirely aimless. Witnesses described him as nondescript, blending into the crowd like so many others in the city's sea of faces. Yet, what separated him from the countless other commuters wasn't visible, not yet. It was buried somewhere deep inside, an impulse that would soon erupt into violence. The stage was set. Two strangers, brought together by chance, or perhaps something more sinister. One asleep, lost in a world of her own, the other awake, watching and waiting. This was the fragile, almost surreal calm before the storm, a moment in time that, for those who witnessed it, would be forever etched in memory. And as the clock ticked closer to the fateful moment, one haunting question lingered. Could someone, anyone, have stopped what was about to happen? To understand the events that would soon unfold, we must first step into the life of Sebastian Zepeda Khalil, a man whose past seemed to carry a darkness that would ultimately erupt in unspeakable violence. Born in Guatemala, Sebastian's life was shaped by hardship from an early age. The details of his upbringing remain elusive, but what we do know paints a picture of struggle. Sources close to his story describe a young man who sought better opportunities but seemed to carry the weight of unresolved inner turmoil. At some point, Sebastian made his way to the United States, likely chasing the same dream that has driven millions of others, the hope of a better life. But his journey was far from smooth. Records indicate that he had been deported from the U.S. on at least one occasion. What led to his removal remains unclear, perhaps a minor infraction, perhaps something more serious. Yet despite being sent back to Guatemala, he found his way back into the country, undocumented and adrift. For months leading up to the incident, Sebastian lived a transient existence. He frequented parts of the city where anonymity thrives, crowded streets, public parks, and subway platforms where people rarely pause to make eye contact. He was described as quiet but unpredictable, a man who blended into the urban tapestry but left an unsettling impression on those who crossed his path. There were signs that something wasn't right. Witnesses who encountered him in the days leading up to the attack reported erratic behavior. He was often seen intoxicated, sometimes muttering to himself, his movements jittery and restless. Some recalled brief but unnerving encounters, his gaze lingering a little too long, his presence unsettling in a way that was hard to articulate. And yet, nothing in his behavior suggested the magnitude of what he was about to do. The morning of the attack began like any other for the few passengers waiting on the subway platform. The air was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made people pull their coats tighter, heads down, avoiding conversation. One passenger, a young man on his way to work, later recounted how he first noticed Sebastian. He wasn't loud or anything, the man said, but there was something off about him. He kept pacing back and forth near the edge of the platform, like he was looking for something, or someone. Another witness, a middle-aged woman who had been sitting a few feet away from the sleeping victim, described the scene in chilling detail. "I saw him walk past her a couple of times," she said. "He didn't look like he was in a rush. It was almost like he was waiting." The atmosphere grew tense, though no one could have predicted why. It was the kind of tension that makes people uneasy but unsure if they should act. Should someone intervene? Should they alert station personnel? Or was this just another ordinary encounter in a city that sees everything and nothing all at once? Sebastian's actions in the moments leading up to the attack would later be dissected endlessly by investigators and psychologists. Why did he target her? Was it random? Or did something about her sleeping figure ignite a specific trigger? A surveillance camera captured him standing a few feet away, his gaze fixed on the woman as she slept, oblivious to the world around her. He reached into his pocket, fumbling for something, a small object, later identified as a lighter. He flicked it on and off, the tiny flame casting eerie shadows on the concrete walls of the station. At that moment, the tension in the air seemed almost tangible. Passengers nearby noticed the flickering light, but dismissed it as nothing more than a strange quirk. No one could have imagined what was about to happen. Sebastian moved closer, his steps deliberate but unhurried. He stood over the woman for what felt like an eternity, the lighter still in his hand. Witnesses described an eerie calm in his demeanor, as if he was disconnected from the reality of what he was about to do. It was this calm, this unnerving stillness, that would haunt those who witnessed the scene for years to come. And then, without warning, the quiet of the morning shattered. What drove him to this moment? Was it rage, desperation, or something deeper and darker, a fractured mind consumed by impulses beyond his control? These questions would remain unanswered as Sebastian lit the flame that would forever alter the lives of everyone on that platform. It was 7:15 a.m. on an otherwise ordinary morning at the Coney Island Stillwell Avenue subway station. The platform was almost empty, save for a few weary commuters, the low hum of the city outside the station filling the space. The day had only just begun, but what happened next would rip away any sense of normalcy. The victim, sleeping peacefully on the cold metal seat of a nearly empty train, remained unaware of the man standing just a few feet away. Sebastian Zepeda Khalil moved closer, his gait slow and methodical, as if caught between hesitation and resolve. He stood over her, the flame of the lighter dancing briefly before he pressed it against her clothes. The first spark was small, barely noticeable, but as the lighter caught, the flames began to lick at the fabric of her coat. In those first moments, there was confusion among the few passengers nearby. Some were still groggy, perhaps too far away to understand what was happening. Others, though, noticed the flickering light and the strange figure leaning over the woman. But it was too late. The fire spread quickly. A wave of acrid smoke filled the air, sharp and biting, stinging the nostrils. A passenger nearby later described how the smell was so strong it made me choke. The flames, fueled by the woman's coat and the sheer unpredictability of the situation, climbed up her body. In an instant, her clothes were engulfed, and her screams broke through the quiet morning like a violent force. The passengers who had witnessed the man's movements in those seconds now looked on in disbelief. At first, it wasn't clear if they were witnessing an accident or something much worse. But as the woman's cries grew louder, the reality set in. She was burning. Some rushed forward, pulling out their phones to capture the chaos unfolding, unsure of how to help. One man, his face pale and his hands trembling, tried to shout for help, but his voice was drowned out by the horror. Others backed away, paralyzed by fear, frozen in their tracks as the fire consumed the woman. Sebastian, the man who had caused all of this, remained eerily calm. It was as if he were watching an impromptu performance, something he had orchestrated with cold indifference. A woman, standing nearby, later recalled, "I saw him standing there just watching her. It was like he wasn't even fazed by what was happening. He didn't even look worried, just calm, like it didn't matter to him." The woman who was on fire fought to extinguish the flames, but they were too strong, too fast. Her coat, likely synthetic, melted away in seconds, clinging to her skin, intensifying the pain. Panic set in as she stumbled off the train, her movements erratic, desperate, and futile. And then in a moment that would haunt all who witnessed it, Sebastian Zepeda Khalil did something no one could have prepared for. He laughed. It wasn't a loud, maniacal laugh. It wasn't the kind of laughter that would be heard from a distance, but it was unmistakable. A soft, unsettling chuckle that sent chills down the spines of everyone around him. He didn't run, didn't attempt to escape, and didn't try to help the woman. Instead, he simply stood there, watching as the flames slowly consumed the life of the woman he had set ablaze. His laughter wasn't a sign of joy or triumph. It was the sound of someone detached from the horror they were causing. It was the sound of someone who could only find amusement in something so tragic, something so beyond comprehension. After a moment, he turned and began to walk away, his steps slow, unhurried, as if he had just finished an errand. He didn't glance back. He didn't look at the woman writhing in pain or the terror-stricken witnesses who were now rushing to assist. The man who had set her on fire had no further interest in the chaos he had caused. His departure was as nonchalant as his approach. He exited the station at a leisurely pace, disappearing into the streets of Coney Island, leaving the scene of destruction behind him. The entire attack was captured on security cameras in excruciating detail. In the footage, you can see the exact moment when Sebastian approaches the woman. His hand moves deliberately toward his pocket, where the lighter rests. A quick flick, and the tiny flame begins to flicker before he presses it against her clothing. The camera angle shifts slightly, and you can see the exact moment when the fire begins to spread. The woman, still asleep, begins to stir. It's unclear if she initially feels the heat, or if she's merely reacting to the unfamiliar sensation of her clothes beginning to burn. Her body twitches as the flames begin to rise higher, wrapping around her torso and then over her face. The horror is immediate. As she jumps to her feet, her screams pierce the air, but it's too late. The fire is already out of control. The camera captures the terrifying sight of her running down the platform, desperately attempting to put out the flames that are rapidly spreading. The scene shifts again, and Sebastian is seen walking away, his back turned as he exits the station. He doesn't break his stride, and he doesn't show any sign of remorse or fear. A few seconds later, the video shows the chaos that unfolds in his absence. Passengers rush to the woman's aid, some attempting to put out the flames, others screaming for help, and a few fumbling for their phones to dial 911. The distress is palpable, and the gravity of the situation sets in only after Sebastian's departure. In the video, one passenger is seen turning to another and muttering under their breath, "Did he just—" They can't even finish the sentence. The thought of the attack is so incomprehensible, so unnatural, that it's difficult to even grasp the reality of what just happened. The footage is haunting. It reveals the chilling indifference with which Sebastian Zepeda Khalil carried out the act. His lack of fear, his composure, and his unhurried departure. These are the moments that would later be analyzed by authorities and psychologists in an attempt to understand the mind of a man who could commit such a crime. But no answer would come, at least not in the days immediately following. The video was shared with the public, but it raised even more questions than it answered. What had triggered this act of violence? Was it a random attack, or did Sebastian have a specific motive? What had driven him to commit this unspeakable crime? And most haunting of all, why had he laughed? After the attack, the city was left reeling from the shocking and senseless violence. But as authorities rushed to piece together the events of that fateful morning, a new chapter of the story was about to unfold, one that would bring both clarity and confusion in equal measure. Within hours of the attack, the surveillance footage from the Coney Island Stillwell Avenue subway station was all over the news. The grainy, yet hauntingly clear images of the man responsible for the woman's horrific injuries were broadcast across every channel. Detectives immediately began working with the footage, hoping to track down the man who had walked away from a scene of unimaginable cruelty. The images showed him exiting the subway station without haste, blending in with the morning crowd. But the slow, methodical pace of his departure stood in stark contrast to the chaos he had just left behind. What happened next could only be described as a swift cascade of events. By mid-afternoon, investigators had already begun receiving tips from the public. People who had seen the attack or recognized the man from the footage began calling in. One tip came from a local resident who had spotted the man walking in the neighborhood just hours after the incident. Another lead came from someone who remembered seeing him in the area frequently, giving detectives the crucial breakthrough they needed. Within hours, the police managed to track down his whereabouts. At 4:30 p.m. the same day, just hours after the horrifying event, a SWAT team descended on an apartment in Brooklyn where they believed Sebastian Zepeda Khalil was staying. The apartment building, a modest complex nestled on a quiet street, had been his residence for the past few months after moving back to the United States from Guatemala. When authorities entered the apartment, they found Zepeda Khalil sitting on a couch, seemingly unaware of the massive manhunt that had been launched in search of him. He was alone, and there was no sign of any escape plan. When asked if he knew why the police had come, Zepeda Khalil simply replied, "I don't know what happened." His demeanor was oddly calm, almost detached from the severity of the situation. It was clear that the investigation had only just begun. At the police station, Zepeda Khalil was questioned in greater detail. His responses were disjointed, almost as if he were detached from the reality of his actions. During his interrogation, he admitted to having consumed alcohol the night before, but when asked about the events on the train, he claimed to have no memory of the attack. He was evasive when pressed about his state of mind at the time. "I don't remember," he repeatedly said, almost as if his words were meant to distance him from the heinous crime. "I was drunk, maybe," he added, but offered no further explanation for his actions. The claim of intoxication would become a key element in his defense, one that he would continue to cling to as the investigation progressed. Whether his memory loss was a result of alcohol, a feigned defense, or a deeper mental health issue would be questions that the investigators and the court would wrestle with for months to come. Psychologists later speculated about his mental state at the time of the crime. His behavior, including the laughter as he walked away from the scene, indicated a lack of empathy, a detachment from the violence he had just committed. Was this the result of intoxication, or was there something more sinister at play? In the days following his arrest, Zepeda Khalil's history began to emerge. A criminal record from Guatemala showed prior arrests for violent behavior, though none as extreme as the subway attack. His re-entry into the United States, following a deportation years earlier, raised more questions. What had he been doing during his time in Guatemala? What had led him to re-enter the country illegally? And what had been his state of mind when he committed such a brutal crime? The mystery surrounding his behavior was not just confined to the attack itself, but stretched backward, trying to connect the dots in a life marked by violence, substance abuse, and instability. But while Zepeda Khalil's actions were now under investigation, there was one critical piece of the puzzle that remained frustratingly elusive: the identity of the victim. The woman who had been set on fire was still unknown. Detectives pored over the scene, searching for any identification that could lead them to her. They interviewed witnesses who had seen her on the train and gathered statements from those who had tried to help her after the fire had been put out. But no one seemed to know who she was. Her clothes had been burned beyond recognition, and she had no visible identification on her. The authorities released a description to the public, hoping that someone might recognize her from the limited details provided. But days went by, and the woman's identity remained a mystery. Her tragic fate had captured the attention of the public, but no one could confirm her name. Speculation began to swirl about who she might be. Some people wondered if she had been a homeless person who had fallen victim to a senseless act of violence. Others believed that she could have been a commuter, simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the longer her identity remained unknown, the more the mystery deepened. Meanwhile, Zepeda Khalil's actions, their complete lack of remorse, continued to baffle both the public and the authorities. Was this a random, senseless attack, or had he targeted the woman for a specific reason? Could there have been some connection between him and his victim? The authorities considered all possibilities, but as time passed, no answers seemed to be forthcoming. As investigators dug deeper into his background, they unearthed a troubling history of mental health issues. Reports from family members and acquaintances hinted at possible struggles with paranoia and delusions. Could these psychological issues have contributed to the severity of his actions? Did Zepeda Khalil believe he was justified in his attack, or was it simply the product of a deeply troubled mind? Despite his claim of intoxication, the chilling calmness with which he carried out the attack and his laughter afterward left many to believe that the crime was not simply a result of being drunk. His disconnection from the victim's pain and his lack of any visible remorse would become central to the investigation and eventually the trial. In the meantime, the search for the victim's identity continued, and with every passing day, the case seemed to grow more complex. Would Zepeda Khalil ever provide the full story behind his actions? And more importantly, would the victim ever be identified and given the justice she deserved? The answers, it seemed, would not come easily. The aftermath of the brutal subway attack sent shockwaves not only through the city of New York but across the nation. What had once seemed like an isolated incident of violence became a focal point for larger conversations about mental health, public safety, and the role of the criminal justice system. The attack, an act of unprovoked cruelty, was undeniably horrific. But it also forced the public to confront some uncomfortable truths about society's vulnerabilities. Within hours of the news spreading about the attack, New York City's social media channels were flooded with reactions. Commuters, once immune to the daily chaos of subway life, were now grappling with the unnerving realization that something as ordinary as a morning commute could suddenly spiral into a nightmare. A subway rider, who had been on the same train as the victim, recalled the terrifying scene in a local news interview. It all happened so quickly. 1 minute, everything was normal, and the next, it was chaos. I've ridden this train every day for years, and I never thought something like this could happen. It makes you wonder if anyone's safe anymore. Her voice shook with a mixture of fear and disbelief, the emotional toll still raw. The victim, whose identity remained a mystery for days, became a symbol of vulnerability to many. As one social media user put it, "She could have been anyone. She could have been my mother, my sister, my daughter. It's terrifying to think that something like this could happen to any of us." While the public's reactions were filled with grief and outrage, the tragedy also sparked intense debates about the safety of public spaces, particularly the subway system. With millions of commuters relying on the trains each day, many felt the city's transit system was simply not equipped to protect them from such horrific acts of violence. The New York City subway had long struggled with issues of homelessness, mental illness, and crime. Advocates for the homeless argued that the city had failed to provide adequate resources for those in need, while mental health professionals highlighted a lack of support for individuals suffering from psychological crises. "This crime is not just about one man's actions," one psychologist remarked during an interview. "It's a reflection of a system that is failing to address the needs of its most vulnerable populations." City officials echoed these sentiments, with Mayor Eric Adams holding a press conference the day after the incident. "This senseless act of violence will not be tolerated in our city," he declared. "We must do more to protect our residents, both from the dangers of crime and from the mental health crises that too often lead to these tragedies." Subway workers and transit employees expressed their frustration with what they saw as a systemic issue that had gone unaddressed for far too long. One subway conductor, who wished to remain anonymous, said, "We deal with dangerous situations every single day, but no one seems to care until something this horrific happens. This isn't just about one person being violent. It's about a failure to take action and make the subway safer for everyone." The conversations that followed centered around the question, what could have been done to prevent this tragedy? Could better mental health screening for commuters have stopped the attack? Was it a failure of the system or an inevitable outcome of living in a city with such high levels of stress and instability? The discussions were heated, but they also brought to light a deeper issue: the need for more effective interventions for people like Zepeda Khalil, whose history of mental illness and violence had clearly not been adequately addressed before it escalated into a deadly incident. In the weeks following Zepeda Khalil's arrest, the legal proceedings began to take shape. The initial charges were clear: attempted murder, aggravated assault, and arson. However, as the case moved forward, additional charges were considered, including charges related to the infliction of torture, as the details of the victim's suffering came to light. Despite his claims of intoxication and memory loss, Zepeda Khalil's actions, his cold detachment after setting the woman on fire, his laughter as he walked away, left the authorities and the public with more questions than answers. Was he truly incapable of understanding the gravity of his actions, or was this a deliberate and cold-blooded attack? As Zepeda Khalil's defense team began to prepare for his trial, they indicated that they would argue that he was not of sound mind at the time of the incident. They planned to present evidence of his history of mental illness, including reports from family members who described troubling behavior in the years leading up to the attack. They would claim that his intoxication, combined with his psychological instability, had led to an explosion of violence. They would ask for a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. However, prosecutors weren't so easily convinced. They pointed to Zepeda Khalil's apparent awareness of his actions immediately after the crime. His calm demeanor as he exited the subway station, his attempts to cover his tracks, and his refusal to offer any real explanation for the violence suggested, in their view, a man who had control over his actions but chose to commit a horrific crime anyway. As the case made its way through the courts, legal experts and commentators weighed in on the broader implications of such a crime. This is not just a case of one man's violent outburst, one legal analyst explained. This is about the intersection of mental health, immigration, public safety, and the criminal justice system. This tragedy exposes the cracks in a system that is struggling to deal with some of the most difficult challenges of our time. As debates raged about mental health care and criminal responsibility, another question lingered in the background. How can society prevent tragedies like this in the future? Was there a way to identify people like Zepeda Khalil, individuals who were suffering from psychological issues but had not yet crossed the line into violence? Could interventions have been made earlier, before the situation escalated to such a horrific level? The attack became a rallying cry for those advocating for more comprehensive mental health services, particularly for those who had fallen through the cracks. It also highlighted the ongoing struggles within the criminal justice system to address crimes committed by individuals who may not be fully aware of the consequences of their actions. In the days following the attack, the city's subway system saw a noticeable uptick in the presence of police officers, as officials scrambled to reassure the public that they were taking steps to prevent future incidents. Yet for many New Yorkers, the damage had already been done. The fear of violence in public spaces, especially the subway, was no longer a distant concern. It had become a real, tangible threat that could strike at any moment. Meanwhile, the search for the victim's identity continued. After days of diligent investigation, her family was finally located, and her name was released to the public. The woman, who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, was identified as Maria Hernandez, a 34-year-old mother of two. Her tragic death sent ripples of grief throughout her community, and a memorial service was held in her honor. But while the loss of Maria was deeply felt, it did little to answer the lingering questions about why this had happened in the first place. The subway attack, though tragic, forced society to confront uncomfortable realities. How much responsibility did the city and its transit system bear for failing to address the mental health crisis that was visibly present among many commuters? Could more have been done to ensure that people like Zepeda Khalil received the care they needed before it was too late? And what about the public's safety? How could New Yorkers feel safe again in a city that had once prided itself on its bustling energy but now seemed overshadowed by fear? As the investigation continued and the legal proceedings unfolded, one thing became clear. The story of the subway attack was not just about one horrific event. It was a reflection of deeper, systemic issues that demanded urgent attention. The case would serve as a dark reminder of the complexities surrounding crime, mental health, and public safety, and the answers to these questions would take much longer to uncover. The subway attack on that cold, unsuspecting morning left a mark on New York City and on the hearts of its residents. Maria Hernandez's tragic death, so senseless and brutal, is a stark reminder of how quickly life can be snatched away, how vulnerable we all are, even in the most ordinary of circumstances. It is a tragedy that not only stole a mother, a daughter, and a sister from her family, but also left the city grappling with questions about safety, justice, and the fragile nature of human existence. As the case unfolds in the courts, the echoes of this attack reverberate through New York's streets. The chilling image of a man casually laughing after committing such an atrocity, further compounded by his subsequent claims of memory loss and intoxication, sends shockwaves far beyond the subway platform. The public's reaction to the crime was one of disbelief. For many New Yorkers, the subway had always been a place of routine. It was a daily part of their lives, something taken for granted, where safety was never a second thought. But in the wake of Maria Hernandez's death, that sense of safety was shattered. It's hard to comprehend that a space as mundane as a subway car could be turned into a scene of unimaginable horror. And yet, it happened. In the weeks that followed, as details of the crime continued to emerge, one question remained unanswered. Why? Why did Sebastian Zepeda Khalil, a man with a troubled history, who had been deported once before and had shown disturbing behavior, choose this moment to act out in such an extreme and violent way? Was he simply a victim of his own mental instability? Or was this the product of a broken system, one that failed to provide the necessary help and intervention before it was too late? Maria's identity remained a central mystery until the day her family was finally found. They spoke out publicly, their grief palpable as they remembered their beloved family member. They described her as a kind, loving woman who would never have imagined that her life could end in such a horrific manner. Her 2 young children, they said, had been left without their mother, a void that could never be filled. The unresolved nature of this case, along with the haunting image of Zepeda Khalil laughing after the crime, has stirred something in the hearts of many. How could someone commit such an act and remain so detached, so uncaring about the life they had just destroyed? It's a chilling thought that lingers long after the media frenzy around the case has died down. As we reflect on the events that unfolded that fateful day, we are left with more questions than answers. What if the system had been different? What if there had been a way to intervene before it all went this far? Could Maria Hernandez have been spared? Could her children have grown up with their mother? These are the difficult questions that we must all face if we are to prevent future tragedies like this one. There's no simple answer, no clear-cut solution, but it is up to each of us, as members of a larger society, to take action. We must demand better mental health care, more comprehensive intervention programs, and a public transit system that is prepared to handle crises in ways that ensure the safety of all riders. In the face of tragedy, we can no longer sit idly by. The story of Maria Hernandez is not just about a single act of violence. It's about the failure of a system that left her vulnerable. It's about a community that must do more to protect its most vulnerable members, whether they are suffering from mental illness, addiction, or homelessness. As we close out this chapter in the story, we are left to mourn the loss of a woman who had so much to give, a life extinguished too soon. Her death, while heartbreaking, has also served as a catalyst for change, a reminder that we must not look away from the suffering around us. Whether it's in our transit systems or in our neighborhoods, we must ensure that no one else has to suffer in silence, and that no one else has to die in the cruel and senseless way that Maria Hernandez did. What can we, as a society, do to prevent such tragedies? The answers are not simple, but perhaps, through a collective effort, we can create a future where violence like this is no longer a part of the narrative, a future where no one has to ask, why? What do you think can be done to prevent tragedies like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. If you've been moved by this story and want to hear more chilling accounts like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. This is just one of many stories we've uncovered. Each one brings new revelations, new questions, and new insights into the darker corners of our world. Stay tuned, and remember, some stories are more than just a passing news cycle. They demand attention.